Chapter 5. Monday, 2:30 p.m. Fast draws. Riley absently used her left hand to brush the rebellious strand of hair away from her eyes. Then, her brow furrowed. She fished her cell phone out with her left hand, keeping her Glock in her right. Keeping her eyes on the street, Riley said, "Lerner, when this is over, we're going to have a long talk. Right now, we need to get back inside. There are more coming from the other end of the street. Damn it, Lerner, get your fucking ass back inside the house." None of the gangbangers on either end of the street made a sound as they oozed towards us. Chuck's crew, easily over a dozen, parted to let a black SUV, almost identical to the government version in front of my house, roll by. Since I doubted that it held more marshals, I moved. Riley and Larry followed me inside. Without a word, I slid down to the floor by the refrigerator. 3 drive-by shootings had occurred within 6 blocks of my house since I moved in. One gangbanger had been wounded, another killed, and a 6-year-old boy, sitting in front of his TV playing a video game, died when a real bullet went through both lungs. If a child died that afternoon, it would be on me. Riley moved to the bedroom doorway, crouched low, and talked on her phone. Looking dejected, Larry stretched his long frame alongside the wall opposite me. I looked up at the computer tower I had spent so many hours building, sitting by itself, unafraid and tall on the kitchen table. We waited. I heard far-off sirens coming from different directions. I glared at Riley, kneeling and preparing for the last stand. Glaring back, she snapped, "What?" I shot back. "All this bullshit because Chuck pulled a fucking cell phone, and that guy Lewis was doing what, smoking too fast? What the hell? Back at you. Who the fuck is Uncle Al?" Riley demanded. When I didn't answer, Larry shook his head at me, his mouth turned down in disappointment. Larry was an old hand in a dirty game, and couldn't care less about the guys like Uncle Al's in the world. They had been his bread and butter for decades. However, he expected better of me. Larry lectured me 1,000 times about the options. Keep the answer truthful and straightforward, as in, Al? He's a guy in the neighborhood. Or get mad and truthful. Al? Ask somebody who gives a shit. Or combine the two. Al? He's a guy in the neighborhood. Who gives a shit? But never lie to a Fed or go quiet right off. Because lying to a federal officer is a crime, and the first thing they do is lay a trap. His favorite was an FBI agent who, while discussing the menu with the waiter, issued the Miranda warning and finished with, "Again, you have the right to remain silent, but tell me the truth. Was the salmon really just flown in?" The waiter, who moonlighted as a drug mule, assured her the salmon had been flown in just hours before. Larry had grinned and said, "Hell, I saw her picture, so I get it." "You can't tell me it held up," I had protested. "Well, enough for her to escort him out in cuffs, which was the whole point. And come on, guys like that are idiots and chicken shits." He rolled over before the night was over. And the lie? He'd laughed and said, "Well, the salmon had been in the freezer." No shit, when she told him that, he cried because it was so unfair. Remembering the story, I looked over at Riley, then back at Larry. He nodded almost imperceptibly, telling me to stay quiet. Riley looked at me the same way a cat looks at a cornered baby bird. Going quiet didn't mean I was guilty. My guilt was a given. Going quiet turned me into a baby bird. I told myself that I was no baby bird with the intellect of a worm. I was an intelligent man who looked like a professional killer. Granted, professional killers don't have faces that stick out in lineups. I was still working on my persona when the first screaming car arrived in front of the house. No one charges a house with the cops on the street. I sat up to massage my back, and Riley angrily motioned for me to stay down. No one burst through the door to save us as more cars arrived, leaving their lights and sirens on. Still, we waited. Then we heard orders shouted and footsteps running up to the house. Again, Riley motioned me to stay down. After what felt like hours, the last siren stopped wailing, and there was a polite knock on the door. I reached into the fridge for another derivation blend, changed my mind, and selected a Wolpertinger. Riley opened the door. A tall SWAT officer strode into my house. He politely turned his head as Larry worked the kinks out, sadly smiled a rejection of my offer of a beer, and then saved me as Riley headed for me with murder in her eyes. He took a quick step, putting his armor-clad body between us. She glowered up at him for a moment, her beautiful face tight with rage, and the supposedly best of the best flinched as he frowned down on her. She was not too angry to care that she was slightly disheveled from our brush with death. She had shed her light jacket at some point, and her white blouse was untucked from her slacks. The top 2 buttons were open, and the unruly strand of hair hung over her right eye. She reached up to brush it away with the little finger of her left hand, her right still holding the Glock. Her face flushed. She took an embarrassed step back, carefully pointed the gun at the floor, and made a small show of securing it. Then she tucked in her blouse and fastened her top buttons. She didn't walk away or even turn around to get herself in order. The officer kept his face neutral. Since he partially blocked my view, I moved to the side. He didn't even glance at me. Smiling to take the sting out of it, Riley said, "You came in kind of heavy, didn't you?" "Not for this neighborhood and not for the situation you described," he answered crisply, obviously annoyed. "I told the dispatcher I didn't see any weapons, though I suspected some were carrying. Maybe we came here to protect them from you. The folks outside said you two drew your weapons when a young man started taking a video of a female marshal. Please tell me that is not true." Well trained, he glanced around to ensure he wasn't hurting the feelings of the biological males in the room. Larry and I nodded to the most obvious female. She frowned and said, "It's a little more complicated than that. The male behaved belligerently and pulled out the cell phone aggressively." "Oh, well, aggressively pulling a mobile device. Why didn't you inform dispatch?" "Don't worry, ma'am, we'll get the bastard. You all stay in here until it's safe to go out. Oh, and I understand you were also unable to apprehend the perp who threatened your vehicle with lighted cigarettes. Can you give us a description? Or better yet, text me his photo. What kind of phone did he have? Apple or Android? Any little detail will help us at this stage." Larry inserted himself into the conversation by stepping close to the SWAT officer. "Look, Junior, we don't need some wannabe G.I. Joes telling us how to do our job. I'm alive because I don't wait for some jacked-up con to let me know he's packing by putting rounds up my ass." G.I. Joe spoke softly. "I was an Army Ranger, and I don't need a brokeback midnight cowboy coming here and waving his gun around." He looked from Riley to Larry and said in a tight voice, "I need to see your identification. Now." I understood the brokeback cowboy, but the midnight part eluded me. Larry growled, "Careful, brother, or I'll teach you the difference between a midnight cowboy and me. You'll find out there's nothing wrong with my back." Riley sighed and looked up at G.I. Joe. They both rolled their eyes. I wanted to ask what the hell was a midnight cowboy. I opened my mouth, but Riley silenced me with a look and handed over her badge. After G.I. Joe handed the badge back to Riley, Larry tossed his badge with a hard wrist flick at the helmeted head. The Ranger fielded it with his left hand. Larry looked at me, and I raised a dismissive eyebrow like it was no big deal. The SWAT team probably tossed their badges at each other's heads over beers at the bar. The tall man studied Larry's badge longer than necessary. I knew he was deciding how hard to flip it back at Larry, and whether to go for the head or concuss Larry with a shot to the balls. Knowing that her slow-draw cowpoke was about to eat his badge, Riley held out her hand. With a shrug, the Ranger handed it nicely back to her. She responded by demanding, "I need to see your identification now." He ignored her and looked over her head to Larry, daring him to step forward, while rolling his shoulders to help unclench his jaw. "Officer, you were asked by a federal agent to show your identification," Riley said, in the same tone she used to tell Chuck and John to get down on their knees. It turned out that Chuck and G.I. Joe had something in common. "That's my identification," he growled, jerking his thumb to the open door where lit-up police cars clogged the street. As he walked out, I saw him make a small circling gesture with his hand. Going to the door, I watched as the armor-clad SWAT team began piling into their van. I stepped back into the room and announced, "They're leaving. Looks like the patrol cars are staying." Riley elbowed me aside and looked out. Her pride kept her from walking outside and asking anyone to stay. When she spoke over her shoulder, her clipped words betrayed her nervousness. "Lerner, pack up. We need to get you out of here. Just take what you need. We can send someone back here later to get the rest." She and I both knew that anything of value I left would be gone before we were a block away. Taking the 4 steps to my bedroom, I looked back at my kitchen, trying to decide what to do with the beer. That also gave the marshals the less photogenic side of my face. while hiding the relief on the other side. I paused at the doorway, looked at Larry out of one eye, and asked the question, "What's a midnight cowboy?" "You're not serious," he replied, his mouth twisted in amusement. "You know what? If you're going to get all pissy on me, forget it," I said, and shut the bedroom door behind me. Gabriella decided not to tell me goodbye, even though I gave her time, as I sat on my bed trying to figure out what had happened and what the hell it all meant. The only conclusion I reached was that I would never be able to explain away the marshals to my neighbors. I had to move, and I might as well go with the marshals. Doing anything else right away might send up flags. When I stepped out of my bedroom, I expected to find Riley looking at her watch, counting the seconds. Instead, I found her and Larry sitting next to one another on my couch. Through the window behind them, I saw officers inside their air-conditioned patrol cars, their lights still throbbing out the message they were in the house. Larry cut off what he was saying. Each of them had a bottle of my good beer. I looked closer. No, not my good beer, but the best, the stuff I kept at the back of the fridge. The beer I hid from myself. Larry winked at me, took a long swallow, and continued as if I wasn't there. "And I'm supposed to give the speech at Jerome's retirement dinner next week. Shit, when this gets out, and it will, I'll never hear the end of it. Fuck me. I can't believe I let those little bastards get away." Riley took a sip of beer, the flip side of gulping wine, ignored my grimace and said, "Larry, they didn't break any laws. You couldn't shoot them." He shook his head and groaned. "Riley, they just blew me off. That's never happened, ever. They didn't take me seriously for a second." "Maybe it's the bolo tie," I offered. He glowered at me. "Dale, maybe you can tell me who Uncle is." He stopped and looked at the floor, embarrassed he'd forgotten the name. Riley finished his sentence. "Al. Uncle Al. Dale, who the hell is Uncle Al?" "So, I'm still Lerner?" Larry gave me a nasty smile and said, "No, brother, you're no longer Lerner, whatever else happens. But until we get a new identity, let's stick with it." "Got that right," Riley nodded, scowling at me as she flashed back to her star role in Chuck's video. "Come on, Riley, it's not that bad," Larry said, reaching a hand to pat her knee. He pulled it back when she shot him a look that warmed his beer. Covering by taking another long swallow, he rolled his eyes at me. I rolled mine in agreement, since she wasn't looking at me. Riley stared at my floor as though trying to divine her future from signs in the dirt I had never swept up. She groaned. "Not that bad? Not that bad? Are you fucking kidding me, Larry? There is a video of me taken with a dead man, one of my witnesses. A fucking guy we need to keep an oversized K95 face mask on for fucking ever." She paused and said, still looking at the floor, "Sorry, Dale. Are we still leaving?" I asked, trying to sound like I didn't give a damn. "Yeah, we're leaving. Just waiting for directions and a visitor. I'm telling you, things have gone to shit. In the day, we'd have already been down the road," Larry said with a sigh. Riley floated up from the couch, setting her half-full bottle on the coffee table. I almost told her to use the coasters, caught myself, and made a mental note to buy some for my next place. As I stepped to the fridge, Larry waggled his empty at me. Why not? I had a feeling Riley wasn't letting us bring a cooler. Riley's voice, knife-sharp, slashed out and stopped me. "Scarface, I just remembered you pushed me when your buddy, Chuck, right? You pushed me when he reached for his back pocket. Why'd you do that? What if instead of his phone, he'd pulled a gun?" I pointed out the obvious. But he wasn't packing, was he? I knew he wasn't pulling a gun out. He thinks he's a fucking movie producer. And he pulls that shit all the time in a neighborhood not big on cameras. Someone would have taken him out if it wasn't for Uncle Al. It works because Uncle Al makes Chuck get his approval before posting anything. And Chuck's not my buddy. She shook her head, and Larry, the ingrate, eyed me suspiciously. "You couldn't know that he didn't have a weapon," she said softly. "Yeah, I could. How?" "Uncle Al doesn't let Chuck carry a gun. He's too big of a dumbass." Larry rose and looked me in the eye. "Dale, who's Uncle Al?" "A guy you deal with if you live around here. What do you care, Larry? After all this time you decide to show up and jam me with my neighbors?" "Oh yeah, and get me on a video with marshals," I said, harshly. Larry cocked his head, suddenly reminding me of my old hunting dog. He glanced at Riley, but she ignored us and looked out the window. Something about how she stood looking out the window held Larry and me in place. I, for one, was a little afraid to turn my back on her. When the front door opened, Larry and I whirled around to face it. Riley, who watched him approach, calmly turned her head to the door. A strong whiff of smoke and a murmur of voices came from the shade along the garage wall. A man, the top of his bald head glistening with sweat, stepped in, looking down at his phone. He took one more step, looked up, and stopped abruptly as he found himself occupying the last available space in my living room. His finger, pecking at his phone, stopped mid-peck and motioned for us to wait. His eyes took us in, lingered for a moment on the beer bottles on my coffee table, and then swept the room. Something told me he even noticed my dirty floor. Shorter than Riley, he weighed as much as Larry and I combined. He was also put together using boxes. A large square box for the head sat squarely on the large box for the body. The neck box had been left out or perhaps crushed flat. Each arm consisted of two large square boxes of the same size, and each hand was a massive cube, probably forged from iron. The boxes making up his legs were slightly larger than the ones used for his arms. Looking down at his feet, I saw what I expected: shoe boxes. He nodded to Riley and Larry in turn. "Good morning. Good afternoon, deputies. So, you had another one tucked right under our noses. This asshole still has the top of his head. Too bad." His voice was soft and low, hinting at some island accent. Riley replied, "What brings you here?" "Heard some chatter and decided to see if you need help." "And you are?" he asked, rotating to me. "You're in my living room, uninvited, and I don't know you," I replied, then smiled my best smile, making sure my good side faced away. The crinkles alongside his deep brown eyes deepened as he frowned at me. "I'm Detective Diana, St. Louis homicide. I knew it was too good to hope for, but I had to give it a shot." "You're not Grayson." Riley looked confused. Larry frowned and said, "No, Diana, he's Grayson. We gave him plastic surgery, shrunk him about a foot, and he takes our special anti-aging treatments. He looks pretty good for 70-something. And how do you like his face? I wish more of our witnesses would let us top off the disguise like that." Diana nodded. "So Grayson's still around? That's good to know. Maybe I still have a chance of running into him someday." Burns, her parents died almost 10 years ago. Her mother called me every week until the end. They never got over it, and finally they both just kind of gave up. He went first, and she followed 2 months later. Guess I could never really explain the big picture to them. Their daughter was their big picture. He looked at me and asked, "So, how many high school seniors did you rape and murder?" Never mind, you're in WITSEC and all is forgiven. Where were you last night?" I started to speak, and Larry, forgetting he was just a contractor, took charge. "Diana, we both know you didn't have shit for a case, so fuck off. This is our witness. He's under federal protection. You don't come in here and start asking questions." The boxman calmly nodded and said, "Actually, he's now a person of interest in my homicide. I can ask him any damn thing I want. But out of professional courtesy, cowboy, I won't ask his name, any of his names. I just want to know where he was last night." Larry's jaw clenched, and I kept my mouth shut. The oak bark creases on the detective's broad face deepened. "The only reason I know he exists," he said, pointing at me, "is because we came here to save your asses and I heard about it. You don't tell us shit, almost shoot one of our citizens for having a cell phone, and then start a riot. You know what? Fuck professional courtesy. I want to know where this guy was last night." Riley pulled Larry back to take charge, but I cut her off by asking, "Who was murdered?" Detective Diana stepped to me, effortlessly moving Larry aside with a belly that I expected to jiggle, but didn't. Larry, his eyes narrowed, checked himself as he started to reach out a hand to grab the detective and stopped. Up close, I saw Diana was made from blocks of granite. Larry's long arms wouldn't reach halfway around the guy. Larry stepped back, his mouth a tight line, and fingered his string tie. He probably regretted not bringing his lariat from the car. I felt sorry for him. First, a bunch of gangbangers laugh off his gun, and then a square boulder of a man moves Larry aside with just his belly. Maybe it was time for Larry to give it up, find a ranch in the country, and watch the sunset from a rocking chair with good lumbar support. I tucked the thought away for a future conversation. I repeated the question. Who was murdered? Detective Diana's box head pivoted on the body box to take me in. I half expected him to transform into an army tank. His real name was James Kaufman. Did you know him? He asked. I shook my head no and spoke the truth. I had never met the man. Okay, I wouldn't admit to knowing that piece of shit either. And just so you know, if you killed or fingered him, the only people who might be upset about it are these guys, he said, motioning to Larry and Riley, then growled, since he was under their federal protection also. My protectors returned his glare with interest. Look, just tell me where you were last night and I'll move on, he said. Sure, no problem. Just as soon as you tell me why you're asking, I replied. He waggled a finger at me and motioned me towards him. I leaned down over his belly. In a stage whisper, he said, Profiling. You look like a killer. I raised my eyebrows and he nodded in confirmation. Riley sighed, and Larry, now a beaten man, didn't say anything. Isn't that illegal? I asked. Detective Dayana chuckled, and I wondered if the anger was an act. Nope, not in this case. The wife disappears, it's the husband or boyfriend. Last year I had a case where it was both. Guy like Kaufman and Witzek, one of you guys took the contract or fingered him. Now, maybe your buddies here rushed over because you and Kaufman are connected somehow, and they're worried you might be next. Or, he paused to look at my protectors, then back at me. Or they think you're a person of interest. Why's that? If you're not connected to Kaufman, why are they here? I was just asking them the same thing, I replied and turned my head to Riley. Larry coughed uncomfortably. The room was so quiet I heard the dispatchers on the radios carried by the officers huddled outside. Inside, law enforcement was not speaking to one another. They are all taught how to use silence effectively on suspects. Apparently, they also use it on each other, out of habit or for practice. Finally, Riley shrugged to show that she was not giving in, just bored. She said, Detective Dayana, there is no connection between Lerner and Kaufman. He doesn't know who Kaufman is, or rather, was. This man is in Witzek as a witness, not under any plea deal. So back the fuck down. The detective snapped back. And he's not connected to Torrentero? Larry's face faded to neutral. Riley hesitated a heartbeat before saying, No. I didn't like their response any better than Detective Dayana. He cocked his head, paused, and said, No? No, she repeated, her voice matter-of-fact. Sure, whatever you say, Deputy, but your witness has asked you a question that I think deserves an answer. If he isn't connected to Kaufman, why are you here? I nodded my agreement, and it became a 2-on-2 game of silence. Granite Boxman and Scarface against the feds. Riley spoke when I turned to salvage a $15 beer. After we left you last night, we were informed there might be someone acting as a kind of bounty hunter. Someone may be hunting down our witnesses. Calls himself Tom Horn. The box ground his jaw, loosened it to sigh, and said, I thought I'd seen it all, but this shit? After you left last night? Sure, whatever. I get stonewalling. You're the feds. Why tell us anything? But you tell your goddamn witness the name of the man who you think committed murder in my town, and you don't tell me? His soft voice became hard, the anger unfeigned. I heard footsteps, and a cop peered inside. Dayana waved him away. Riley started to speak, and he snarled at her. Shut up! I've heard enough! Here's what's going to happen. I'm taking this up the chain, all the way up if I have to. You go ahead and take your witness wherever the fuck you want. I suggest you do it fast, because the people out there who came to help you are going back to work as soon as I walk out of this house, and they aren't coming back. You're on your own. He took 2 quick steps to the door and wheeled back to us, surprisingly graceful given his bulk, and pointed a finger at me. You didn't tell me where you were last night. We'll see how that works out for you if we make you for Kaufman's murder. Like I said, he was a real piece of shit. And now that I know he was stashed in my town, I have an idea about a couple of unsolved cases regarding young girls. How Kaufman got into Witzek, I'll never understand. But I'm going to make sure nothing gets overlooked in his murder. You know why? Sharp eyes peered out from the fractured crevices in his face, challenging me. I didn't answer. He snorted derisively and snarled. Because I damn well know it was one of you shitheads these assholes put in my town. Guys who get away with rape, murder, and all sorts of shit. Guys who we catch and some prosecutor lets go. But not you, Scarface. You're a real witness. Right? You were here on a plea deal? My ass. A guy looking like you and living in this neighborhood is into something. And I'm going to find out what the fuck it is. Looking at Larry, he said, Leave it to you to try to start a war over a cell phone. He waggled his finger at me and said, Just remember, all it takes these days is DNA. I put away a guy for life because he sweated doing a job. You believe that? He smiled. Just a drop of sweat. You think about that, Scarface.